Hi, my name is Jillian Grennan, and I am a neuroscience PhD student through the University of Washington. This is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2022 meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology, and today I will be presenting estimating ACT-R declarative memory parameters using a drift diffusion model. ACT-R is a cognitive architecture that can provide a framework for interpreting cognitive and neurological data, and is made up of discrete modules such as declarative memory, perceptual modules, etc., that communicate with each other through buffers. Each of these modules can be described by a cognitively informed algorithm, and similarly are able to be mapped onto discrete brain regions that have been well validated through neuroimaging data. ACT-R can be used to simulate responses to common cognitive tasks or fit to a real-life participant's cognitive data to inform about cognitive processes, identify individual differences, or parse out mechanisms of psychiatric disorders. Declarative memory in ACT-R is stored in record-like structures called chunks, which are used to represent semantic and episodic memories. Chunks have an associated scalar quantity, or activation, that represents a probability of a memory to be retrieved at any given time. This probability decays exponentially over time and increments after every retrieval of the chunk, capturing both recency and frequency effects. Thus, activation reflects the transient increases in the availability of a piece of information as it is processed again. If presented with information that could possibly retrieve multiple chunks, the chunk or memory with the highest activation at that time is retrieved. Parameters such as a participant's response latency, decay parameters, or activation noise are all manually set by us, the model creators. A common challenge of ACT-R is how to estimate these set parameters when making a participant-informed model. This is typically done through methods such as a parameter grid search, but this is pretty computationally expensive and doesn't typically allow for statistical verification. So there's a need for a way to better integrate empirical participant data into the parameter estimation process for the creation of these participant-informed models. We used a common mathematical model that could potentially be used to estimate the starting ACT-R parameters from empirical data to better inform the parameter estimation process. The drift diffusion model, or DDM, is a well-validated model of a two-choice task. DDM is used in dissecting and modeling diverse components of trial-level behavioral data in the context of two-choice decision tasks. As a high-level overview, DDM utilizes each individual's distribution of reaction times and errors across each trial in a given task to quantify a set of parameters that together produce the optimal fit to the individual's actual distribution of responses. DDM models a binary choice task decision through the continuous random walk process, which assumes that the participant, when presented with a binary choice, accumulates information continuously, and that information is available to the participant as a one-dimensional quantity. A counter on this dimension changes as a function of time, and the decisional process continues until the counter reaches either one of two decisional thresholds, A or 0. The model of the dynamic behavior of the counter is described by the Wiener diffusion process, or Brownian motion with constant drift. This has both a systemic component that will have a constant change over time and a random component of noise that varies the directionality of change, so will move the counter either towards the upper or lower threshold at random. So say the upper threshold represents the correct decision and the lower threshold 0 represents the incorrect decision. Either the random noise will summate enough to make an incorrect decision, or the participant will accumulate information to the point of reaching the upper decisional threshold. Using this model, we can parse apart components of a binary decision process. With DDM, we were first able to look at the parameter z, or decision starting point, with a higher z indicating a bias towards the upper decisional threshold and a lower z indicating a bias towards the lower decisional threshold. The next parameter is decisional separation, represented by A, so essentially a measure of the amount of information needed to make a decision. A higher A indicates the participant needs more information before comfortably making a decision. We were also able to measure drift rate, or V, which represents the quality of the information that is being accumulated, or overall cognitive speed. A higher drift rate means that the rate of information accumulation is quicker. Finally, we were able to extract T0, or the extra decisional component, which is representative of all processes not directly part of the decision-making process, such as stimulus encoding, the motor component, or the time it takes for a participant to orient to the probe. Besides aiding the parameter estimation process of ACT-R, we were also hoping that integrating DDM into ACT-R would allow us to put the DDM parameters into a neural circuitry context, because as of right now, DDM parameters haven't been shown to have replicable neural correlates as cognitive architectures such as ACT-R do. Recent work has shown that we can treat the ACT-R declarative memory module as an evidence accumulator model, and therefore can map DDM parameters onto the declarative memory parameters within ACT-R. In order to see how best to do this, we first explored similarities within the equations that make up these models. The total expected time for retrieval of the winning chunk C with activation AC across a series of trials using the average latency factor F with scaling factor T error can be shown by this equation here. DDM assumes evidence accumulation at a constant rate. So the equivalent equation within DDM is represented by the expected time for accumulator C to reach the upper decisional threshold A, and is dependent on the decisional starting point Z and drift rate V with a scaling factor T0. The probability of receiving a certain chunk over competitor and ACTAR can be represented by this equation here, in which the probability P of retrieving chunk C with activation AC over a foil F with activation AF is dependent on the difference between these activations of the two competing chunks. This is similar to the equation for the evidence accumulator to reach the upper decisional threshold A. DDM is different from other evidence accumulator models in which there are two separate accumulation processes occurring for each choice or chunk, as DDM actually incorporates the difference of these two possible decisions into the evidence accumulation process. In DDM, the probability P of accumulator C with drift rate V of reaching the upper decisional threshold A is defined by the equation shown here. Using these, we can then utilize the obvious similarities between these equations across models to map ACTAR parameters onto those outputted by DDM. We found that F in ACTAR, the latency factor, is related to the relationship between the upper decisional threshold A and the decisional starting point Z or bias in DDM. Drift rate V within DDM is related to the difference between the activations of the competing chunks within ACTAR. Here we adapted the equation to reflect the difference of the average activations by competing chunks C and F to be represented by delta A. Similar to previous work, we see a direct equivalency of the extra-decisional component within an evidence accumulator model of DDM and that within ACTAR. Given this mapping of parameters, we thought it should be possible to recover ACTAR memory parameters from those outputted by DDM. We used ACTAR to simulate 25 distinct model participants, each performing a sequence of retrieval trials. Retrieval was modeled as a competition between two chunks, C and F, representing a correct and incorrect response to a retrieval queue, respectively. For each participant, ACTAR parameters were randomly sampled from plausible distributions, and you can see the distribution of parameters on the left. In each trial, the response time was a time in seconds required for the winning chunk to reach the decision boundary, and you can see the generated response distribution on the right. Negative reaction times in this case represent incorrect trials. To understand the optimal trial size for consistent ACTAR parameter recovery, we attempted the parameter recovery simulation at varying trial sizes from 25 trials per participant to 5,000. As you can see, at trial sizes beyond 100, we see fairly consistent recovery parameters, leading us to believe that as low as 100 trials per participant is all that is needed for accurate ACTAR parameter recovery. Here's a more zoomed-in view to show that at 100 trials per participant, we see a fairly linear recovery of the recovered ACTAR parameters compared to the original in all three targeted parameters: the difference of activation rates between the two competing chunks, or delta A, shown in blue, the latency factor F, shown in orange, and T error, shown in green. Across varying trial sizes, we calculated absolute error and correlations across the recovered parameters. Notably, we saw comparable absolute errors and correlations of original versus recovered parameters at trial sizes of 100 trials per simulated participant or greater. Both F, shown in orange, and T error, shown in green, showed a relatively consistent increase in correlation and decrease in observed absolute error as trial sizes increased from 25 to 5,000 trials per participant. We were then curious to see if we could recover reasonable ACTAR parameters from an empirical dataset to inform a simulated ACTAR model. The data used here came from an experiment carried out by Bernstein 2014 and is freely available on OpenNeuro. 20 male and 10 female participants performed the color word stroop task, which consisted of congruent, incongruent, and neutral stimulus conditions. Participants were presented with word stimuli and were instructed to respond to the color in which the word was printed, but also to ignore the meaning of the printed word. In a congruent condition, the words green, blue, and yellow were displayed in the colors green, blue, and yellow, respectively. The incongruent condition showed words whose meaning was a different color than the ink in which the printed word was displayed. So for example, the displayed word was blue, but it was printed in yellow ink. In neutral conditions, a non-color word was presented in an ink color. So for example, the word chair was printed in green ink. Our first step was to accurately fit DDM to the ACTAR generated data, which we were able to do successfully. We observed a reasonable fit of DDM to the empirical distribution, which was further verified through the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test statistic. Here's a randomly sampled participant's estimated cumulative distribution function calculated using the estimated DDM parameters on top of a histogram of the empirical response time distribution. Excitingly, we were able to recover reasonable estimates for all three recovered parameters across participants and trial types, so we were confident in implementing these estimated parameters into an actual ACTAR model. A simple model of the stroop task was implemented to test the possibility of translating DDM parameters directly into ACTAR models. This model borrows the central idea of previous models of response interference within the stroop and Simon tasks and captures the stroop effect as interference in the color name retrieval due to competing sources of activation. Specifically, the model responds by initially focusing on the word's color. While attending to the color, the model attempts to retrieve an associated color name. This retrieval process is aided by activation spreading from the attended color to the corresponding name. So for example, from the color green to the word green, which confers an additional boost of activation to the correct color name over the equally active names of other colors. Once the color name is retrieved, a production rule performs a corresponding motor response. The simplicity of this model makes the DDM parameters immediately translatable. Specifically, the difference in mean activation between the competing chunks, or delta A, corresponds to the contribution of spreading activation from the word's color. The T-air parameter corresponds to the duration of motor execution, once the visual encoding time and the execution time of the necessary productions are accounted for. Note that although by definition T-air represents time components split across both the visual encoding and motor module, functionally it does not make a difference which of these it is incorporated to, because it will just be added to overall reaction time. We ran individualized ACT-R models with these inputted parameters for each of the participants with the same number of trials as in the empirical study, so 42 congruent, 42 neutral, and 36 incongruent. We are interested to see if ACT-R simulated data of a Stroop task that utilizes these estimated parameters will provide a comparable reaction time and accuracy distribution to the empirical data we originally inputted into the DDM. This will provide reassurance that this method is applicable in integrating empirical data into simulated ACT-R models. Across the 28 participants, we saw a relatively linear recovery of mean reaction time and accuracy across participants, as shown in this graph here, with the original inputted reaction time and accuracy on the x-axis and the recovered ACT-R reaction time and accuracy on the y-axis. To ensure these participants were indeed individualized to the participant and not just a factor of task, we randomized the estimated parameters across participants and again compared the recovery of mean reaction time and accuracy across participants. As seen in the scrambled image, this recovery is substantially worse if parameters are not matched the original participant, providing evidence that this parameter estimation method is sensitive to and sustains individual differences in its integration into ACT-R. So in summary, across trial sizes as low as 100 trials per model participant, we observed a fairly consistent and linear recovery of the extra decisional time component T-air, the latency factor F, and the difference of activation rates between the two top competing chunks within a simulated declarative memory retrieval task. This provides proof of concept that ACT-R parameters are indeed able to be estimated using DDM. This parameter estimation process used low computational power and was easy to implement given the accessibility of DDM toolboxes. To further emulate this model's applicability, we utilized this DDM ACT-R parameters estimation method on an empirical dataset of a Stroop task. We demonstrated that by using DDM-derived parameters, we were able to estimate ACT-R parameters within typical ranges according to prior studies. Most excitingly, when we integrated these DDM-derived parameters into an ACT-R simulated Stroop model, we were able to accurately recreate the reaction time and accuracy distributions observed within the empirical dataset, as shown by comparing empirical versus recovered mean reaction time and accuracies. Most notably, these parameters seem to be individualized to the participant, as randomization of these parameters showed a worse recovery of empirical mean and reaction time and accuracy across participants. Some limitations of this study, and potentially this method, are that this empirical data application was used in a very simplified ACT-R model and only used in the context of the declarative memory module. We believe that in the further applications, one could apply this method to multi-alternative decision-making tasks instead of just binary choice decisions that actually fully utilize the declarative memory module. But we are unsure how this could be applied to tasks that rely heavily on a complicated procedural memory module. Future work is needed to understand the exact breadth of this model's applicability. With that, I would like to thank the entire Cognition and Cortical Dynamics Laboratory for their help in supporting me for this project, specifically Dr. Andrea Stocco, Sherry Yang, and Holly Hawk for their guidance. I would also like to thank the graduate program in neuroscience through the University of Washington that has provided my funding for this year to make this project possible. Thank you so much for listening.